Hi everybody, welcome to episode 215, I think, 216. As usual, don't know. Today
what are we going to talk about?
Dermatomes and myotomes. So it's actually a very important thing. I've been working on for a long time. Like the dermatomes, I looked at that a long time ago, and I just had a message from Philip. Thank you, Philip Kreiner. Who sent me something about the myotomes, which I was not aware of. So kind of, but not really. So I started to, he sent me like a book to look at and everything, and this is a very, very interesting thing. So as you all know, there's the internal torque and external torque map. Mm-hmm. Right, so I've always looked, and then I linked the internal torque, external torque to parasympathetic, sympathetic, but mostly the idea was that, you know, there are two movement patterns, really, toward the center or away from it, right? So Wilhelm Reich has linked that to the chakra points way back in the day, the points of the spine, things like that. So I've been looking for a long time to like an anatomical description of that internal torque versus external torque and why the chakra points and stuff like that. So I had looked at the dermatomes before. But so dermatomes means what? Means that areas of the skin and below are linked directly to the spine, but by spots. Mm-hmm. And they all obey certain lines that are there. So I found that was very interesting, but my interest is always toward muscles. So that I looked into it, but I did not find exactly what I was looking for in there. And it turns out it's because I was missing the myotomes and the fasciatomes, and there's a bunch of them like that. But what interests us for today is dermatomes and myotomes. So what is a myotome?
That's a good thing to
start
with,
right? So a myotome is a group of muscle that is linked through one innervation. So one vertebra would have a nerve coming out of it, and link a sequence of muscles.
So a sort of a chain
of muscles, that are linked to one vertebra through one innervation.
So an example of that?
Oh my God. Like for example, the infraspinatus, is hooking to the pec major and stuff like that. Yeah. So each vertebra does different things, mm-hmm. but there is a chain of muscle. There are many chains of muscle that are linked through one innervation, to only one nerve. Mm-hmm. But all of them are in one link to one specific vertebra. So one of the most important is the C6, for example, and the S1. It's because suddenly you have like the glutes, but they're not there. So, for example, like we talk about the psoas all the time. Very interestingly speaking, the psoas is not linked to the L5, S1, S2 that links all the posterior chain. So the glutes, the hammies, the stuff is not linked to the psoas. The psoas is linked to the quads, the adductors, so like the squat muscles, if you want. The glutes are squat muscles, but you get the idea. Mm-hmm. If I look at a hinge, that's not the psoas isn't there, because all that is glute, hammies, all that stuff is S1, S2, L5. The psoas is L4 and above. So you have stuff like that. So that means that, there's a lot of meaning to this. But we're going to use as an example the shoulder and arms, because and that's very interesting, the dermatomes and the myotomes are the same. So the areas, the muscle that are linked through that nerve are also linked through the contact of the skin. So it becomes one group, which I find very interesting. And so if we start to look at this, we have the shoulder and the arms are where the dermatomes and the myotomes are what is called congruent, which means their equivalency. The C6 control a chain of muscle that also corresponds to the skin that follows it, that covers it, the skin and the flesh that covers it, and the fascia, but that's not true for the trunk. Those, they don't work like that. Yeah, so you have things like that. So back in the day, I had explained that to me, this seemed to be a 1, 2, 3 of how the body works. Like the shoulder and the arms were one way, and the trunk muscle was a second way. Well, from a neurological perspective, it seems to be true. So I'm just going to use this part to explain a little bit better, right? So if we look at the thoracic spine versus the cervical vertebrae, right? It doesn't work the same on how everything is connected. So a myotome, again, is a sequence of muscle, right? All right, so let me start with that. A sequence of muscle linking to one vertebra, and like so the C6 will have the shoulder, the arm, and everything. But if you go higher, you're going to go more towards certain parts. So, for example, this part of the finger, right? So the pinky finger, for the one on watching the video, right, hooks all the way to a line that goes toward the rear delt, right? Whereas the middle two fingers is the C7. The thumb is a C6. So that means that the action of the thumb affects a different vertebra than the actions of the pinky if we follow the muscles going that route. So it interests me because it means that if there's a sequence of muscle that is linked to one nerve, it means that there is no such things as isolation. We cannot take muscles in isolation. We can only take them into movement patterns, which I've been trying to say forever, like the whole Da Vinci stuff, right? You cannot say the rear delt because it makes no sense. The rear delt will only work within a specific movement pattern. So it turns out there's a lot of specific movement patterns, almost based on each vertebra. So each vertebra leads to a specific chain of muscles being used at the same time in the same idea, right? So that means that the C6, in a way that uses the shoulder and an arm, is going to have a different movement pattern than the C7 because they don't link the same chain of muscle. They might link the same muscles, but not in the same chain because they don't link the C6 and the C7 might link certain muscles, but not others. So therefore, it changes the movement pattern. So it seems that each vertebra has its own movement pattern. So there is no isolation. There is only movement patterns. And that is a massive change.
That is gigantic.
And what is very important, if I look at the shoulder and the arm, is that you can find it in the fingers.
So then you go grip, proper grip.
Right, so that means that if you look at there, that means that the activation of a sequence of muscle is commanded by the spine, but also because of the dermatome through the contact, so prediction versus observation. Right, so observation, so that means that proprioception at the hand will establish a specific chain of muscle that goes all the way to the spine. So that means that the grip will change the movement pattern. So that's the proprio grip I was talking about for months and months and months and months. So there's an actual neurological mapping of that. You can follow the nerves and you find specific grip in a proprio grip type of thing. So to go back to that internal torque, external torque, that means that suddenly we can be far, far more precise into it. So for example, if we look at the thoracic one, myotome, we see an area that is very interesting that goes from the spine, so thoracic one, right? That goes across to under, that line goes across to under the rear delt. So you have a line that goes from the spine to the rear delt, and it's going to go through the pec back here. Like, so imagine a band that goes right under your rear delt, right through your armpit, and it goes around like that, right? That's the thoracic one. Myotome. What I find interesting with this is it's exactly the internal torque stuff I was showing. So you see that, for example, with CrossFitters, especially female CrossFitters that have no teres major, right? No low trap 3, so the low part of the trap. They don't have rear delt, and if you go, they don't have the pec major activation. They all upper pec shoulder trap, so the shoulder there, but they don't have that thoracic one line. And you see that pattern emerging a lot amongst female CrossFitters. So suddenly that brings a very interesting question. What if it's, and that's been my position forever, maybe it's CrossFit that does not, because of the lack of certain movement pattern, like working in the frontal plane or whatever, has weakened the thoracic one myotome. And so you see it also on the skin that is softer there, that can hold water, or that is just not as, it's not as connected because the myotome is under challenge, let's call it this way. That movement pattern is not being used. And so because that movement pattern is not being used, we see the entire line weakening. And so suddenly, because you don't activate the pecs, you don't activate the teres major that specific way, or the rear delt that specific way, or whatever. So the movement pattern is lacking. And we see it as not a muscle, but as a movement pattern, as an entire group of muscle linked together a specific way.
Yeah, so you cannot do the band activation to activate certain parts because you need to have that whole movement.
Right. So then suddenly we go back to the idea that then you can't isolate the pec.
Yeah.
If you're in the thoracic one type of movement pattern, you will have the pec, but you also have part of the teres major and the rear delt and the da 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 da. So you can never isolate. You have to think in movement patterns.
Right.
So, but as a assessment tool, it becomes fantastic because imagine if each sport were lacking specific movement patterns, and each sport always does, obviously. But then we would be able to assess that movement pattern that is lacking, therefore know exactly which muscle are lacking from the not being engaging that, and therefore design a better assistance work for that particular sport in order to balance the equation.
Yeah.
So for me, I had like like engage your lats or whatever, but suddenly we could be far more precise. Because if we understand which muscles are lacking, we start to understand which movement pattern is lacking. Once we understand the movement pattern, we can just recreate that as an assistance work, because then by knowing exactly which vertebra and then we're talking about, we can track better the best possible assistance work for that specific movement pattern. So instead of saying like, my trap 3 doesn't work, it's not enough, because if I do the trap 3 from a different movement pattern, it will not help me getting better at that problem. So we see that a lot. We see people that can have large glutes, like me, for example, but they don't work well in specific movement pattern. So the key then is to not work the glute. The key is to work that movement pattern that will work the glute, that will help me get better. So that's why I was saying, like 2 podcasts ago, I was like, don't isolate the rear delt. What I'm doing is I'm pulling the frontal plane with straight arm. So let's say I'm doing that, right? So I have 2 ways of pulling in the frontal plane with straight arms. I could do it through that thoracic one and using not the rear delt, but using more like a certain muscle in my back. So I would do that through, like the proprioceptive, the bottom finger, and I would use more toward the lats and feeling the stress also stretching my pec major. Or I could look at the different movement pattern, which is going through the C6 myotome, which is activating the shoulders and certain parts of my biceps and my upper pec, because I'm stressing toward the, instead of getting trunk muscle, I'm going more toward the shoulder, because after all, I'm trying to get the rear delt. So then I'm going to go to a movement pattern that goes through the C6 myotome. So I know the C6 is the thumb. Then what I would do, I would actually press the pec deck like this, and open up like that, and suddenly instead of going toward the trunk muscle, I'm staying within the shoulder. And so now I'm doing a frontal pull with straight arm, but I will target my actually rear delt better. But I did not target the rear delt, I target the proper movement pattern, because it will not just develop the rear delt. And as I did this, I started to feel my upper pec on the right a lot, but not on the left, because on the left it's not nearly as developed as it is on the right. So I was talking about that, like the fact that I have an issue. And if you see, it's a C4 myotome that starts into the pec here, into the trap here, that goes into the pec, that goes into the bicep. So suddenly, I can try to develop the upper pec, I can try to work on the long head of the bicep, but the progress are not there. Yes, because I'm having the wrong idea of working muscles. So I'm trying to find the long head of the bicep, but that does not help me toward movement. And therefore, it is not as useful as if I understand the concept better and work a movement pattern that will give me the long head of the bicep, the upper pec, and the trap, and therefore fixed in balance. But because in a way, instead of working, in my case, the C4 myotome, I would work the rear delt or the upper pec through a different myotome, but therefore never truly going at the issue, and therefore never fixing it correctly. So I could work the upper pec and always have the same problem, because it's not the upper pec, it's which myotome are you shooting for. So the key is there is no isolation. Or if there is isolation, it's not isolation of muscles, it's isolation of myotomes, of a chain of muscle. So it seems that's how the body is built. It is not built based on isolation of muscle, it is built based on isolation of myotomes, if we want to be precise in how we move. And it happens that all those myotomes are to be found in the feet and the hands as well. So there's an entire chain from the spine, from each vertebra, and one vertebra can have different myotomes, by the way, but all the way to the hand. So there are a lot of movement patterns that can be distributed from each vertebra a specific way by following a chain of muscles. So when we think in movement patterns, we have to think in myotome. And then for this part, the myotome and the dermatomes are the same. They're called congruents. They're in the same place. They correspond to each other, which means that any touch within that area will allow me to get the muscle activation better, because obviously it's going to be far more, if I understand this correctly, it's going to be far more efficient to follow a specific movement pattern. The feel of the movement pattern will be the same as the muscular movement pattern. So suddenly you're flowing far more. That would explain the neoprene. Why the neoprene is allowing you to fire the muscle better? Because it applies pressure on the skin, dermatome, that allows you to touch the right muscular chain, the myotome. So that's why I think the neoprene works well on top of the sympathetic reaction. But again, it works either at the dermatome, therefore at the myotome, because I understood the sympathetic stuff. I didn't understand as well why the neoprene was allowing me to target muscles that were in freeze. Yeah. And the reason it does is because it's not muscles in freeze, it's movement patterns in freeze. So, which makes more sense. Why would a muscle be in freeze? It's not. The movement pattern is in freeze because that particular myotome is not firing because X problem at the vertebra. So what the neoprene will do then is it will activate the dermatome that will tell the myotome to start working. And I was like, oh, that makes sense. So this is all stuff I'd said before, but now we have the map for it. Now we have the map for it.
There's now a reality to it, and
right.
You can explain it a lot.
We can explain why.
Because you can also start to explain the openers even better. You know?
Right, so now, yeah, well, let's talk about that. So that's why all that shit was, and I knew he was right. But first of all, I could not explain the neurological reality of it necessarily, to a degree, but not as far as I wanted. And second of all, this gives me a map of it. So I can have the internal torque, external torque, but far more precise now.
This is going to be
far more precise.
2.0 version of the map.
Of the map, exactly. Because now I can go through movement patterns in external torque or external torque. And for example, it's very interesting, but the hinge pattern is linked to the S2, the sacroiliac 2 vertebra myotome. If you follow the S2 myotome, you see exactly the posterior chain that I always talk about, that I put on the map on the internal torque. And the thoracic one is the same for the upper body. So there are keys like that of movement pattern, internal torque, external torque. Yeah, and so suddenly we're going to be able to have a very, very precise map of the internal torque, external torque, based on myotomes. So when I say based on vertebra, yes and no, because different vertebrae do, one vertebra can do more than one thing, obviously. But there's, again, chains of muscle linked a certain way means movement patterns. So there's actually precise, very, very precise movement patterns we can actually map. So imagine that what that will give us out of the internal torque, external torque chain. Suddenly. So that's all. So let's go back at the opener. So I was right. So the opener, it's not I was right. That's not the point. There's the opener. But so what we can do now is we can make the openers far more precise by understanding which movement pattern they follow exactly. So if I look at the tricep opener, right, that I've been talking about lately, and why it works so well, and how I get like that spot up there of the triceps firing, and why it helps me on the bench and everything. Well, it's simple. If I look at the thoracic one on the deadlift, at the thoracic one myotome, it involves the pec major and the tricep. All right, so exactly that. But if I'm going to look at the dermatome, when I raise my arm right there, there's going to be an entire line that takes from the tricep all the way into the lat, all the way into the pec. So that thoracic one dermatome and therefore myotome at that place follows exactly where I'm burning during the tricep opener. Because the thoracic one had a very specific movement pattern that happens to be exactly what I'm doing on the tricep opener, which means when I do all this, I'm working this part low into the lat, except this goes all the way into the pec as well. So there's actually a way to make the tricep opener better by engaging the pec as well. So it's going to allow us to make, so I would do the tricep opener, but I would finish with a specific movement in internal torque through the pec to finish the movement. I'm going to try that tomorrow. So there's a way now to make better openers out of this. And when I have a map of the myotomes, and basically I have a map of all the openers that are necessary.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and the C6 is the key to a lot of it.
She can like per
Yeah.
movement better. You have an
Yeah,
opener.
I mean there's a lot, but
And they
but so
combine
for
them
the
into,
measure,
yeah.
but more importantly, it tells me which exercises to put in an opener, the sequential. So what I liked about this part of the tricep opener is I could engage the lats, but I should also engage the pec.
Yeah.
To finish. So that means that we're going to finish the tricep opener once I burn here. We're going to turn it in, which is why I think this movement works so well at the end, because it engages the pec in internal torque, which is why all this burns so much, because we're just finishing within that particular myotome. So instead of finishing like this, we're going to turn around and finish with just that way, and then you'll see that the whole thing will keep on burning, because actually what we're doing is we're just following the myotope map. Just we found it by experience, but now we can actually have a map to follow. So we can create new openers and make them far, far more efficient. So it's a shit. And by the way, out of all that, also one of the most important part is the way I grab the handle will change the opener.
And the way you plant your feet.
And the way you plant your feet. Because it seems the myotome goes all the way to the foot, all the way to the hand, obviously, since they connect to the spine. Yeah. So there's going to be a way to make the opener better also by grabbing the handle. So that's what we're going to do tomorrow. So I knew, for example, the thoracic one stops here, but the C8 goes all the way to the pinky. So that means that the external part of the hand is what I need to press on in order to get a better engagement of the lat. So when I finish the tricep opener like this, I'm going to make sure that I only grab with a proper grip, the last two fingers, to make sure that I engage the lats even better. Whenever I'm going to go back to doing some cable flies to finish the tricep opener tomorrow to test, I'm going to stay with an appropriate grip. I'm not going to let the index finger get involved, because that would take me toward more an external torque movement, because I'm higher than the C6, where I'm trying to be in thoracic one. So it changes a number of things like that, but they all also relate to internal torque, external torque. So then suddenly I understand why the cyclical is cyclical. Because I was doing always this, because I'm shifting from one myotome to another just by changing my hand position. So I was doing that on cable, going from out to in or in to out. And what I'm doing is I'm cycling the myotomes. And by the way, the myotomes are linked to the parasympathetic versus sympathetic. Of course they are, and certain organs, and so the list keeps on going like that. But for us, what interests me so much is that we're going to be able to have much more precise openers. Yeah. Because suddenly I know which the exercise has to hit the chain of muscles then. Right. So we can just look which muscles I'm going to try to go. I can't find the infraspinatus, but there's a group of large muscles that I'm going to hit in sequence like that from the exercise and through the proper grip in order to create the proper movement pattern. What I find the most interesting out of all this is that it shows that there is no isolation of muscle, there is only movement patterns.
Yeah. I would agree.
And an added bonus to that is suddenly it gives me a reason for emotional mapping. Because then, and by the way, I was wrong about one thing then. Emotional mapping is not about muscles, it's about movement patterns. Yeah. So it's not safety is in the hamstring, safety is in the hinge, done a specific way. But it's not in a muscle. There is no muscle, there's only movement patterns. And so it's very interesting because even at the, let's talk about that, because at the foot level, I find it very interesting. It was showing that whether you are on the heel or the outside of the foot or the center of the foot or the big toe, you would not activate the same myotomes. So the heel was toward the S2 right? The center was toward the L5, the big toe was toward the L4, and the outside of the foot was toward the S1. So you had different myotomes based on where you press on the foot, which seems to be as complicated as the hand, if not more.
Yeah. From a practical perspective, with running, I always felt like that because there's when you're sprinting versus when you run long distance, you use the foot differently and all of those things. But you also feel different muscles activating. There's a different state of mind in it as well. And you cannot run, by the way, on your heel. Almost. You can use it, but you cannot run. So, otherwise, you get certain problems.
Right. What I find interesting with this is the heel is S2, which happens to be the attachment of the piriformis, which is the cause of back pain for most people. Yeah. It's tightness in the piriformis. So that means that, by the way, within all this, we have to start to go eccentric, concentric, so that's going to change. So you could maybe land on the heel, but you could never push up the heel, which is what people do. So landing on the heel is a problem, but pushing up the heel is a greater problem. So we're going to talk sprint versus gym, like leg press, squat, and all that stuff. So first of all, before we go back to sprinting, that means that you can lower a squat on the heel, but you cannot push off of your heels. That's a mistake. You have to lower on the heel so that we activate the S2 and everything. But when you push off, you're going to have to push off the ball of the foot, because otherwise you're going to stay within a certain part of your posterior chain, but you're not going to engage the quads as well. So, for example, what was very interesting is you had the L5, S1, S2. It was all the hammies, glutes, calves, and all this. But the second you wanted to go to the adductors, the quad, and everything, you had to go to L4 and above, and the psoas. So that means that if you press off of the heel, you will not activate the quads and all that stuff correctly.
Which fits within the cyclical idea, because a movement starts and finishes.
Exactly, right, exactly that. So, and the opener that I've been doing for the lower body when I one leg press, I lower through the heel, but then I push off the ball of the foot, otherwise the quads don't activate. Yeah. So that's why I could never get the quads activated too, is because of the broken foot I stick on my heel. So I always give me a big ass because it's always that, but I cannot push off of that. So I could lower the weight very well, but I could not explode. So how many times did you see me on a heavy squat coming out of the hole and then doing a good morning? Because I'm not activating the quads because I'm staying on the heel with a broken foot, because
which makes your lower back hurt.
My lower back hurt because this foot being so broken, I could not. It's very hard for me. The muscle like right here, which happens to be toward the L4, does not allow me to rock forward under big weight, or at least unconsciously I was avoiding it because the muscle there is not strong because I broke my foot so badly when I was a kid. I told the story. So that muscle needs to get stronger for me to be able to not rock forward, but keep the pressure from the heel into the ball of the foot to activate the quads to go past the sticking point onto the squat, which I always struggle to do. Yeah. So going back to sprinting, what is interesting with sprinting is that you land on the ball of the foot and push off of it. So it's a completely different set of muscle than you do if you land on the heel first. Yeah. So you know where I noticed that? I was doing the dumbbell. Yeah, go ahead.
But like if you sprint, it can almost like, it's a different feeling. It's not a different mindset as when you do a long distance run, which I find very interesting as well.
I was doing the dumbbell, the monster dumbbell, and you guys can check that on the push press. If I keep the weight on the ball of my foot when I go down and up, I don't have the same drive into the dumbbell that if I lower on my heel and rock on the ball of my foot. If I stay ball of the foot, I have a much better drive than if I go heel there. Which I find very interesting, because when you're going to jump, if you stay on the ball of your foot. Yeah, no worries. You don't go on your heel first and then go forward. But if I were to control the weight down, it might be interesting to do it on my heel, which is what I do on the leg press. Yeah. So it changes the activation of muscles completely. Because it's not activation, what you're changing is you're changing the movement pattern. Yeah. We have to think differently. So how many times did you say that the sprint drills were necessary to strengthen the muscle of the foot? Because those muscles of the foot will change the movement pattern. Yeah. So that's why people run like shit. Yeah. Because they have their own sequence.
Yeah, and it's always a specific type of people who do certain sports that run a specific way.
Right. So the way you land on your foot will change the way you run. Yeah. You're landing. And that's why you'll see a 5K runner does not land the same way as a sprinter, because literally it's not the same movement pattern, which we know, all of us, we know, but now we can map it.
Yeah, exactly.
Now I can tell you where you land, because you're going to have like the outside versus the middle versus the inside of the foot, will target certain things differently.
Well, and you can use the drills to learn to use the foot in the lifting as well.
In the lifting as well, because again, like a lot of people complain about back pain. Most of the time, it's a piriformis issue. A lot of time, it's like you see that with like the long-term runners, they have like super tight. When they say tight glutes, what they mean is the piriformis is short. The piriformis hooks onto the S1 and the S2. That's the heel, but that's also all the posterior chain that is lacking. So maybe the piriformis is doing too much because there's a pressure on the S1, S2 because of the lack of muscle in the posterior chain. But what I found again very interesting is that the psoas is not linking to that. The psoas links to when you're on the ball of your foot. So that connection, the psoas connects the lower body to the upper body, is better when you're on the ball of your foot, because you're going to a squat pattern more than a pure hinge pattern. So if you want to jump with weight there for muscle dumbbell, you're in a squat pattern on a hinge pattern. So you want to stay on the ball of your foot. So suddenly you go like, oh. And by the way, all that, most of us will go like, I knew that. Yes, but now we can map it.
The thing is you can feel it.
You know it. You know it. There's no question.
It also has to be like this because from the cyclical, you know that every movement is a circle. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So now you can finally explain what the circle is.
Right.
Where to find it.
Right. And then why the cyclical has to be also acyclical sometimes, because depending on the movement pattern, the cyclical motion is not possible, because that is not the goal of the movement pattern. Because remember, if it's linked to a vertebra, now we start to go into the prediction, observation, everything, but then there's going to be a purpose to it that the prediction is based on at that vertebra. Each vertebra having its own idea of what it's supposed to do. So that takes movement pattern even further and everything. So now that we can map dermatomes and myotomes, now we can put the internal torque, external torque, cyclical, acyclical, that decides the eccentric versus concentric, and we can map movement patterns. So we can get away from isolating thinking in muscles, but we can start thinking in movement patterns. And turns out there's a shit ton.
Yeah, it was interesting because like a lot of the courses that have been given on running, they're either from long distance runner or from very short sprinters. One says push into the ground and the other says lift off of the ground. And I always thought that was both, because it is both.
It is both, it just depends.
Yeah.
Right.
But also because it's a cycle. I mean,
right, so it's a cycle. Yeah, it has to be both. And so everything has to be both. That's why we are living in gyms. So we are recreating movements to copy what normally we would find in nature. In nature, we would not have all those issues. Yeah. I think that's why I like the sled and all that stuff, because the movements are so natural, because you're doing something that is a cyclical anyway, and if you're going to grab it a certain way. I can't grab a rope here. I have to bring it this way.
So the rope pulls fix most issues.
Yeah, and then gets to the pecs right away. Like if you're doing the rope pull correctly, you're going into the pecs. You know why? Because you're going toward this, which is the thoracic one. So then your pecs are on fire. And why also you feel your triceps most of the time. Yeah. Because it's a super strong tricep opener, even though it's not exactly the same pattern. And that's why your shoulders hurt less. Yeah. And then why you're pressed like this, and why when you press the sled like that, if you see when you press, you don't press here. You press through the palm of the hand when you press a sled forward. So that means I'm not here, I'm not in the upper pec, I'm just into the lats and pec major, which is where I feel the pump. But then that's why it feels so good, because it fixes the shoulder, because it's not a shoulder exercise, it's a trunk exercise. And that's why if you see people that lean forward, they're going there. So they're doing a different movement pattern. But so again, we know all this, but now we can map it.
Well, that's interesting.
Now we can map it.
Yeah,
so now we can have.
You can use it for assessments. You can.
Right, and that means that certain sports, the imbalances created are not muscle imbalances created; they are movement patterns.
So you can almost have a specific type of base
of assistance work per sport. Exactly, that's exactly that. We can have a precise workout per sport now.
Super
because that sport does not involve that movement pattern. Can be the same thing for someone who had trauma, broke a vertebrae or stuff like that. They're going to lack a certain movement pattern. So now we can work our way back in through the hand into a specific movement pattern to try to get away from the trauma. And I think that's where emotional mapping comes in. Is the trauma fucked you up at certain levels, and the movement patterns allows us to recreate. So obviously,
so
dealing with
the trauma is in the chain, not in the muscle.
It's not in the muscle; it's in a chain.
Yeah.
Which makes sense because it's in the vertebra. So the trauma is kept within the nervous system. It's kept within a myotome, dermatome, or it's not just those, but there's an entire list. But you get the idea. Yeah. It's kept within the spine.
This is going to connect so many dots together and make a physical, like...
Yeah, so there's a map that can be designed, and then there's a preciseness now that can come with all of this. And so we can design, first of all, there's a bunch of new openers I can think of looking at the maps, but we can also design them specifically for what is needed for person, sport, trauma.
Oh, it's it, yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So I have so many things.
Right, exactly. So there's a lot of stuff to try. So I'm gonna start with the bicep and tricep opener. And if you want to have fun at home and see what I'm talking about, do the bicep and tricep opener this way. You do it one time with those 3 fingers, right? The last 3 fingers, and one time with the thumb and index finger only. And you're gonna see that the bicep opener becomes a different movement. Do the same thing with the tricep opener, either the last 3 fingers or the index and thumb, and you'll see what I mean. It's not the same. In the same token, if I want to hit the shoulders more, I want to go index and thumb. So whenever you do a shoulder workout, if you're more toward bodybuilding or assistance work, do it with the fingers and thumbs. And you'll see that you'll get a better shoulder activation. Not that it's a shoulder, but because you're getting a better movement pattern for what you're looking for. You're taking the trunk out and relying more on the shoulders. So from a isolation in that sense, it would be a much better workout because you are addressing the right movement pattern.
Yeah, same thing for the hemi, remember?
For the hemi, yeah.
What we did with the banded curls and stuff like that.
Exactly.
Why it's such a difference between the two. And
right, and by the way, it also means that whenever we stretch or whenever we do mobility work, the position where we press on the foot and on the hand matters tremendously. So I would suggest when you do mobility work, either stretching or bends or stuff like that, pay attention to how your foot is pressing into the ground or how your hand is pressing into the bend or whatever it needs to do. Make sure when you do that work that there is something pressing into the foot or the hand so that you get the movement pattern you're trying to get better at. Because that's going to change. So when you do yoga, your positioning of the hand on the ground will change things. As if you're a good yoga practitioner, you already know. But it's far more important than you think. So it's not just proprioception. It's actually, it's not just how you feel on the skin. It actually has a profound effect on the chain of muscle being used. So that matters a lot. And so this is what we're going to work on because now I need to map all of this.
This
and
is also like means the shoes you're wearing are very important, by the way.
When you run, the shoes matter a lot. When you lift, the shoes matter a lot. And so barefoot, baby.
Yeah, exactly.
Barefoot. Yeah. But again, try the lower opener by lowering through the heel and pushing through the ball of the foot. You'll see what I mean. On the leg press, the difference is crazy. Anyway, this is a mapping that I'm going to do this year because this shit will take me forever. But we will have an internal torque, external torque map with the cyclical, acyclical, far more precise through myotomes, dermatomes.
Yeah.
Off we go.
Off we go.
Bye, everybody.
Ciao.